For coming on. You've heard the House Speaker say, look, this is a clean CR. There's nothing to negotiate here. President Trump says his administration, for his part, will release a list on Friday of, quote, Democrat programs it plans to cut permanently during the shutdown, but will spare, quote, Republican programs. I want to get your response to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, two things to say about that, right? I mean, the American people can look at what the president has said, and the American people can decide whether they like a federal government, the most powerful entity on the planet, that will, I guess from now on, and someday there will be a Democratic president too, be devoted to hurting those communities that represent the other party. So, again, people can make their own judgments about whether they want that to be the future of this country. With respect to the shutdown, what the Speaker and what my Republican friends want is they want the total power that they were granted by the American electorate last November when the American electorate gave them the Senate, it gave them the House, and it gave them the White House, but they don't want any of the responsibility. So as a result, you hear this ludicrous blaming of the Democrats for this shutdown, even though, and Americans feel this in their bones, even though they have every lever of power here in the U.S. Congress.
Well, they say, look, the Senate Democrats aren't getting on board because they're saying that it's about the ACA subsidies. This is a clean CR. You voted for short-term funding bills in the past. You've also criticized them and advocated for a thorough appropriations process. But with the White House now using the shutdown to lay off workers, why not vote to end the shutdown and the suffering?
Well, what's different about this moment right now is two things. Number one, the president has shown, and the Republicans in the Congress have completely acquiesced, that he has no respect for Congress's budgeting authority. It's right there in the Constitution in black and white. Congress gets to make the decisions about where dollars go. That's not acknowledged in the White House. So, as you might imagine, in the minority party, in the Democratic Party, we say, wait a second, if we pass a budget, what guarantee, if any, do we have that the deal we made gets kept? Because the deal that we made in the last go-round of the CR with Kevin McCarthy, a continuing resolution of CR, for which he lost his job as Speaker, they just obliterated it and said, no, sorry, we're not abiding by that agreement. The other thing that is happening, Pam, and this is what really matters, after years of Republicans trying to shut down the government in order to take away health care, we are now watching, and as we speak, people are getting letters in their mailboxes saying your premiums will double. Your health care insurance premiums will double. They will triple. That is happening right now, and the Democrats are just saying, hey, we heard the president say that this is something that he worries about. Let's fix it now. People need to make decisions about health insurance in the next couple of weeks. So the Speaker's idea that, oh, yeah, we'll open the government and maybe we'll negotiate with you in December, that is way too late for millions of Americans who are going to see their health insurance go away if we don't solve this problem right now.
Certainly, health care subsidies are important to voters, both Democrat and Republicans. But how much is this issue being used by Democrats to show the base that you're fighting back against President Trump?
This issue is about health care insurance, right? There is nothing amusing or partisan or political about saying we should not force 10 million Americans off their health insurance or put them in a position where they've got to stop paying their mortgage in order to pay their health insurance. There is nothing political about that. There is also no question, though it is separate, that when you see DHS officers slamming into a car of an individual and then ripping the woman whose car they have hit out of that car and forcing her to the ground, yes, there are a lot of Americans who are saying, this is not what we want in our country. This is not what we voted for. Maybe in Chile under the dictatorship, maybe in other dictatorships like North Korea and China and Iran. But in this country, we don't have masked armed agents ripping civilians out of their cars. And so, yes, of course, there is a upwelling of desire that the opposition party, that's my party, say, hey, this is not consistent with American values and it must stop.
Speaker Johnson, as I noted, is talking, and he is blaming Democrats for the shutdown. So I want to listen to what he said and get your reaction.
I'll just say this. There's something that should be remembered by everyone. Democrats say that even missed paychecks for U.S. troops won't be enough to end this shutdown. The Democrats, who we just demonstrated, represent thousands and thousands of the most heroic men and women on the earth, refuse to put their unserious partisan demands to the side and pay the troops.
What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, I'll say what I said 2 minutes ago, which is the American people at some level are not, they get this, right? The Republicans have the Senate. they have the House, they have the White House. So for the Speaker of the House to point at the Democrats and say, though we control every level of power in D.C., it's those darn Democrats that are holding us up. The American people understand how absurd that is, and as a result, and you can look at the polling, and at the end of the day, this is about pain being visited on air traffic controllers, on the military, just as you pointed out. But if you look at the polling, the American people are not so stupid as to believe the Speaker that even though he controls everything, the White House, the Senate, and the House, this is really the Democrats' fault. Look, nobody's buying that.
Before we let you go, I want to turn to the situation in the Middle East and play some of what President Trump recently said about Hamas.
If they don't disarm, we will disarm them. And it'll happen quickly and perhaps violently. But they will disarm. Do you understand me?
Yes, you say
because everyone says, oh, well, they won't disarm. They will disarm. And I spoke to Hamas, and I said, you're going to disarm, right? Yes, sir, we're going to disarm. That's what they told me. They will disarm, or we will disarm them. Got it?
Should the United States disarm Hamas even through force if it doesn't disarm itself?
You know, that sounds an awful lot like boots on the ground. You don't have to be a military expert to know that if you're going to disarm thousands of people who have AK-47s in basements and tunnels, it probably involves boots on the ground, which I think is not something the American people are ready for. Look, I understand what the president is doing. This is a very sensitive moment. And by the way, kudos to the administration. I'm usually pretty critical of this administration, but kudos to the administration for negotiating this deal. But for this deal to survive, two things must happen. Hamas must abide by its obligations to hand over the remaining hostage, and Israel must abide by its obligation to pull back behind a determined line and to let aid in. Right now, neither of those two things seem to be happening as intensely as they should be happening. So I don't blame the president for saying, you guys got to abide by what you said you would do. But Americans should make no mistake. And by the way, I don't really believe that. You know, whatever I think of Donald Trump, he's a guy who has his, finger on the pulse, certainly of his own political base. And his own political base, if you went to MAGA and said, we're going to put a bunch of infantry on the ground in Gaza, they would laugh you out of the room. They would do worse than laugh you out of the room. They would throw you out of the room.
Yeah, and as part of the peace plan, there's no troops on the ground in Gaza, but there is still a question of how do you disarm Hamas by force, of course. You brought up, both sides are sort of not upholding their end of the bargain here. Israel told the United Nations, and the United Nations confirmed that Israel is pulling back on aid into Gaza, food, medical supplies, that kind of thing, because they say Hamas isn't turning over the remains of those who are deceased, the deceased hostages. What do you think about that? What is your message to Israel on that?
Look, I think two things. Number one, I think both sides need to give, the Israelis and Hamas need to give each other a little bit of room. You have one of the most chaotic, apocalyptic landscapes on the planet. So if Hamas says we can't locate two bodies because those bodies, those individuals were in a, bombed out zone where we can't locate them, the Israelis need to give them a little bit of room to do that. And by the same token, you can't simply turn a military around on a dime. So Hamas and everyone else need to give the Israelis time to safely pull back to the lines that they've agreed to do so. Now, what is not okay is using that aid as a bargaining chip, right? So this aid is food and medicines and clean water that is going to a civilian population. So it is not okay for the Israelis to say, well, if Hamas is not complying with their obligations, we're going to take it out on the civilians in Gaza. That is actually what Hamas does. Hamas is the group that uses the Palestinian civilian population as shields, and the Israelis should not be tempted to go in that direction.
Very quickly, President Trump said that he had talked directly to Hamas about disarming. What is your reaction to that?
Yeah, I was a little taken aback by that. My understanding was that our conversations had been indirect with Hamas. But you're right. I'd love to know the facts about whether the president actually spoke to designated terrorists. I guess I was a little caught up in his promise that we would disarm them. Right? Again, there's sort of an aversion to yet another land war in the Middle East around here. So I caught that, but I was sort of more concerned with his promise that we would be disarming a terrorist organization, hiding in tunnels and burnt out buildings in Gaza.
All right, Congressman Jim Himes, thank you so much.